Today's episode of the DevEd podcast is produced by Thinkster.io. With the rapid pace of change to front-end and back-end frameworks alike, staying up to date with your skills can be tough, but it doesn't have to be. With our expert-led courses on Thinkster.io, you have instant access to hundreds of courses on topics ranging from Angular, React, and Vue to Python, Rails, Docker, and a whole lot more. You can even customize your learning path to include any combination of front-end and back-end technologies that are relevant to you. Thinkster.io, a better way to learn.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the DevEd podcast. I'm Joe Eames. I'll be your host today. And we have on our panel, Sam Jeline.
Hey.
Jesse Sanders.
Hey, everybody.
Luis Hernandez.
Hola.
Mike Dane.
Hey, everyone.
And as a special guest, we have Nell, and I'm going to butcher your last name, Shamrell. I can't even see the rest of it now. Harrington.
Hey, everyone.
Is the Shamrell part right?
The Shamrell part is right. Yeah,
Okay.
it's a very Irish sounding hyphenated last name. But hello, everyone. I'm Nell Shamrell-Harrington. I'm very glad to be here.
Is it Irish?
So Shamrell is actually Italian, but it sounds Irish, and I'm mostly Irish ancestry, so that's what I go with. Harrington, I believe, is it's one of those European last names. When I got married, I hyphenated.
Cool. So our topic today is going to be about learning DevOps. We brought Nell on. So let's have Nell, if you could give us a bit of a background about you, a little bit of your bio, and then talk a little bit about your DevOps specific background.
Sure. This is actually a great show to be on because I come from a non-traditional background. I was a theater major who also happened to do computer science courses when I was in college. I graduated in 2007. The economy crashed horribly in 2008 and 2009. So there were a few theater jobs to come by before, and there were none at that point. So I got a job at the University of Washington. And once they figured out I could code, they started giving me more coding assignments. And I've been doing that ever since. I'm currently a principal engineer at Chef Software. I get asked what restaurant I work at a lot when I wear my sweatshirt that says chef on it. So we're not those kinds of chefs. We do back-end infrastructure software with a very heavy focus on DevOps. I am also one of the co-hosts of the Adventures in DevOps podcast.
Awesome. So do you still do theater?
I do some voice acting, which I really enjoy because I can do it from home. I would absolutely love to be doing productions with, rehearsals six times a week, but that it isn't possible right now. But I would love to go back to it. But the nice thing is I do a lot of conference speaking because it's a way of unifying my left brain and my right brain and nurturing those two aspects of myself at the same time.
That's awesome. I think we're going to need to bring you back on for another episode. So we want to talk about learning DevOps today. This is a really interesting subject because DevOps is this like weird piece of development. So I think one of the things that would be really nice to do is just stop and talk about really what DevOps is. Talk about the difference between DevOps and other aspects of Dev, what's unique about DevOps, and then we'll get into some other questions about why to care about it and some other stuff. But I think it would be good, and Nell, this is probably the best, you're probably the best person to answer this, is really to talk to the general audience about what DevOps is and how does it differ from what we traditionally think of as development.
Certainly. Well, I find that trying to define DevOps is kind of like trying to define love, in that everyone has a slightly different definition or a slightly different emotional reaction associated with it. But roughly, you notice it's a combination of the words dev and ops. So in a lot of IT organizations, you have your developers who write the code, add new features, fix bugs. So that's one team. And then you have your operations team, which is usually a team of system administrators who are responsible for deploying that code and keeping the infrastructure that code runs on running. So these two teams have historically had a pretty adversarial relationship, because developers want to add new things. Operations professionals want to keep the site stable, and it kind of feels like those two priorities conflict a lot. What the DevOps approach is, it uses aspects of both culture and technology to help developers and operations realize they actually have the same job, which is to enable the business to function. It is a combination of cultural things. A lot of it is about how we treat each other. Turns out when you treat each other as human beings, things go a lot better. When you don't have an argumentative culture going on, things go a lot better. And it is very much associated with technologies as well. Things like cloud computing, things like containers, because it is associated with still deploying those applications as fast as possible, but you're doing it in a way that both developers and operations are working together, many times using several of the same technologies to get out stable things faster, iterate faster, and help the business survive and thrive.
That was a great definition. I really want to dig into this cultural aspect a little bit because you've obviously thought a lot more about this particular aspect than I have, even though I've been doing around ops for quite a while. But like this cultural aspect, I've never really thought about that, how DevOps is actually like partly cultural. Could we dig into that just a little bit and talk more about if you're running DevOps and running it correctly, how does culture play into how you design the teams, the dev and the DevOps teams?
Right. So the answer to this is interesting. I mean, something you'll see on people like to snark on Twitter, most obvious statement ever. And one of the things I often see is if you have a DevOps team, you're doing it wrong. And what they mean by, I don't agree with that, but what they mean by that is DevOps is supposed to be something, an umbrella over the development teams and the operations teams. Some companies decide to put a special team in between them called the DevOps team. And that team often focuses a lot on building pipelines, things to that effect. But as far as the cultural aspects go, again, I've worked at a lot of organizations where people were fighting constantly, and they were very siloed because they cared about what their team did. Development, historically, if you've read the book, The Phoenix Project, which I highly recommend if you'd like an introduction to DevOps, it's a fable introduction to it. But in it, you have development team that's just focused on getting features out by the deadline to get them out, and not thinking that the operations professionals need time to make sure that code can go out safely. This often leads to an adversarial relationship. And then you add in security, who a lot of people will, in IT organizations will say, well, security just always says no. And yeah, if you don't consult them until the thing is ready to deploy, they are probably going to say no because there's some things that they had not been thought about, or some risks associated with it that could have been avoided if the security team was brought in earlier. So it's very much about cooperating from the beginning. I have been one of those developers who went into my own little world, developed my Ruby on Rails application or .NET application, whatever it was, put it up in a tarball and sent it to operations and said, here, deploy this. That's not only technologically risky, that's me, if I were to continue doing that, that's me not realizing that the operations team need context before they can deploy it. And no one likes being the team that people just throw things over the wall to, and then whoever threw it over the wall considers themselves done. The thing about DevOps is it's never done. It has some resemblance to the agile methodology for developing software in that we're iterating as we go along. The thing is, it's not just the software when it comes to DevOps. It's also the infrastructure that software runs on. One of the things I tell people is, the one constant in the world is change. And as the world changes, your business is going to have to change, which means your software is going to have to change, which means that the infrastructure you run that software on is also going to have to change. And the thing is, change is always going to be risky, but there's ways to mitigate that risk, some through technologies, which DevOps certainly embraces, but also just talking to each other early in the process when things can still be caught and adjusted to before we get too far along. The classic example of something that went wrong is healthcare.gov. Does everyone else remember when that first premiered? Yeah. So there's been a lot of analysis into what went wrong there. But one of the key things is they had different contractors working on different parts of it and not communicating with each other about the changes they were making. So when they came together at the end and tried to, shovel everything in together at the same time, it didn't work because they hadn't been talking to each other. And I remember, I think Wired magazine did a feature about it, and it interviewed people, one of the contractors who said, yeah, we knew it wasn't going to work. We just didn't want to get the blame. So blame's a big part of or avoidance of blame is a big part of the cultural aspect of DevOps. Again, it's not enough if the business falls down or the business's application falls down to say, well, we did our part, so it's not our fault. It's everyone's fault when that happens. You hear a lot of companies saying, everyone is responsible for our applications and our software. Well, the thing about everyone being responsible is that usually means no one is responsible. And it means that there needs to be some sort of accountability, but not an adversarial accountability. What I mean by accountability is we hold ourselves accountable from the beginning of making sure the software and infrastructure as a whole work. And that was a very long answer to that question.
No, that was a good answer. I think it'd be interesting to open this up a little bit to the panel and talk about our experiences with DevOps and DevOps teams, and especially if there was cultural issues that people have seen going on.
I was just going to say really quick, I love the fact that you opened up with the adversarial relationship, because I think it's something that in some organizations has existed, and it's something that if we don't talk about it, it just doesn't come to light and we don't get it resolved. So I really appreciate that. Go ahead, Dane.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one thing I've seen just in my experience with DevOps is a lot of times it's just the specific team that handles everything. So the team that's handling the development is also handling the DevOps. And kind of getting back to that culture point, I think a lot of times, at least in my experience, there's been one or two people who are kind of like the DevOps gurus on the team. And then if you have any DevOps questions, you go to them. But it's mostly just on the team itself to handle all of that. So I think that's one of the cool things about DevOps is you can section it off between different teams in an organization.
What about culture? Have you guys worked in places where the DevOps and the development teams, if they were separate, had cultural clashes, or where the culture fit really well and they work together? And in either case, any ideas why that was?
I've definitely had both. I can remember, as recent as about 10 years ago, working with a company. I think I worked with them for about 5 years, and every time we'd go to do a deployment, it was challenging. And I think part of the challenge there was that we were completely 100% siloed off from each other. And so there wasn't, within the organization itself, there wasn't a good mechanism for facilitating that kind of communication. And I think it's a challenge in the software industry, and probably a lot of other industries, where we tend to silo, let's say the developers from QA, from product, from DevOps. And then when things go wrong, what happens is we all start pointing the finger and go it ain't me, it's them. It's, somebody else's problem. And so I've also worked in organizations where we've eliminated those silos and we're actually all working together. And when it fails, we all fail. And to me, that's the harmony that happens in a successful software project where we all are held accountable. There's usually one person that's ultimately accountable, but we're all responsible for making sure that, hey, we're doing our part, we're communicating, and we're not just throwing grenades over the wall and then wondering why things are blowing up in a really odd way for us.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens too when you silo out those different sections is that there is a handing off of responsibility. If I'm a software developer, I might say, okay, well, my only responsibility is to write the code and test it, and then I just hand it off to whoever. But I think specifically culturally, there does need to be this culture shift where we say, okay, I'm a software developer. I'm responsible for every stage of this software until it gets deployed. So I think that's a cultural shift that's probably happening. And if not, I think it needs to happen. We need to take more responsibility for every stage of the process.
How could you encourage people, whether or not you have a separate DevOps team or the developers are doing the DevOps, but how can you encourage people to, even if you don't have a separate DevOps team, this is going to happen. You're going to have some people that take more responsibility for the DevOps processes than others, right? Some people are they're going to know it better. And it is oftentimes one of those things where the people who do it end up keep continuing to do it. But how can you create a culture that lets the communication lines flow and doesn't create that? If you have two separate teams, there's a natural shift to, we did our part, they didn't do their part. How can you encourage a better culture in those cases?
One of the things I've done at organizations I've worked at is I worked at a company a while ago and we said, all right, we want the developers and operations to get along better. So let's put the whole two teams in a room together and talk about something after it went wrong. That turns into a blame game really quickly. It's too many people in the room at the same time. And again, it goes very much into that, kind of tribal aspect of, all right, this is what we do. It was not our fault. It was their fault. What works better is selecting a few representatives from each of the teams and putting them together in a room and start, having, the developers shadow the operations professionals to get an idea of how they work and vice versa. And what you find is often things that seem like really big problems are due to tiny miscommunications that could easily be remedied if people talked more and sooner. So I find getting some representatives of each team together, if you want to start to heal that adversarial relationship, is a good way to do it, at least initially, and work through the baggage, if you will, and start working together to move forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so I'd like to move on a little bit and talk about DevOps from let's say I'm a newer developer. I'm getting into development. Why should I care about DevOps, whether or not I'm on a team that does have separate DevOps or I'm not, and we're doing our own DevOps, or maybe I'm even working on personal projects? Why should I care about DevOps versus just focusing on doing more dev tasks?
I sometimes give a presentation called Web Operations 101, and I always start off with, on the slide, showing the Heroku upload command. I say, okay, who here has run this? And usually a bunch of hands go up. And I say, all right, have you ever wondered what's underneath the hood of this? And some hands go up, because the great thing about things like Heroku is, they make it so if you're developing on Heroku, you don't have to think about what's going on under the hood. But Heroku only gets you so far. As your applications become more complex, as you have different needs, you have to sometimes construct the application in a way that makes it conducive to the infrastructure or where you want to deploy that application. And it's so helpful to have an understanding of that when you are working as a developer, when you are writing your code, having an idea of where it might be deployed.
What about the rest of you? What do you think about why people should care about DevOps?
I just think it's a natural progression in the knowledge of any software developer. When you're a beginner, you're just learning how to program, you're learning maybe how servers work and stuff like that. But mostly you're running things on your local machine. But if you want to build something real and you want to deploy something that's going to be out there, ultimately you have to deploy it to some sort of an environment. And by default, you're going to have to be doing some sort of DevOpsy stuff. So I think if you want to take that next step as a developer, you have to kind of delve into that DevOps area. So I just think it's a natural progression, and it's something that all software engineers should get into.
And also, it was born with the times that before, it was like so separate having the developers from the operations team because you have metal on your data centers and all, that was handled by someone else behind locked doors. But now with the advent of technology, like you mentioned Heroku and others like Netlify, now as a developer, you have the opportunity to go through the whole process and go from an idea to something published on the web. But as you said, even though in the beginning it feels like for basic stuff it's going to be pretty simple, but since we have that power now to go all the way to deployment, I think it's important that every developer, once they get to a point where they feel comfortable with the development process, that they move into learning about DevOps. And that way, again, this opens up great opportunities for someone that needed a bigger team before. Now they could go all the way and put their ideas out there. So it's something that I see a lot of value in.
Just kind of piggyback on that. I think it makes us better developers when we start to understand what it takes to deploy an application and what goes into the CI/CD process. So whether we're using Circle CI, Heroku, Travis, one of those types of tools, when we understand what that build process looks like, and then the continuous delivery of it, in setting environmental variables, those sorts of things, those start to impact how we write our code, how we start to think about not just writing a single page app that runs local to my machine really well, but an application that's actually going to be deployed across multiple environments, potentially multiple machines. How do we synchronize configurations? all these things start to come into play in our architecture, our design, what we're putting together. And if we're locked in a little box and our tiny little world of, hey, I don't do any sort of DevOps sort of things, then I don't plan for those things. And thus my applications, in especially as they grow and potentially expand, then they suffer from that, and we have to go back and try to fix those items later.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that specifically what you're saying, because as I was thinking about this, it's almost inappropriate and incorrect to even talk about dev and DevOps as separate things, right? They bleed into each other so much that to consider one without the other, as we've been saying over and over again, matters. But just thinking about some of the recent changes, when the last time that I was seriously involved in some fair amount of DevOps at a fairly big project, things were radically different than they are today. But if you look at those changes are only possible as development itself also responds. As an example, cloud functions, right? You could do amazing things with Jamstack and cloud functions that affect the performance profile, the cost, the abilities, and they are centered around the actual development of the application. They have to be radically developed extremely differently in order to take advantage of these types of things, right? But that only works if dev and the operations side are both working in concert together to consider all of this sort of stuff. So that's a really important part about the fact that dev cannot ignore DevOps. You're doing yourself a disservice to spend any time trying to ignore DevOps as an understanding. For me personally, I built a lot of my career around software engineering practices, testing and automated testing. And the DevOps aspect of that and designing the pipelines and the CI systems and stuff is an integral part of that sort of thing. And if I were to have ignored that, that would have been a big disservice to myself, is trying to establish and say that, become better and better at doing a better job. Because if you write tests and they're not well integrated into the CI pipeline, then you might as well have not written them.
I have a related question for Nell. One buzzword that always gets thrown around with DevOps is infrastructure as code. And I was wondering if Nell could define that for our listeners.
Absolutely. That's one of Chef's, at least it was one of our main slogans. I don't know if it is now. So the way I found Chef actually was I was working at a hosting company as a developer, and I was responsible for my own servers for the first time, which talk about giving me a match and very, very flammable things that I could break. But what I found is, traditionally system administrators would keep the configuration of different servers all in their head. The little configuration flags, little commands that have been run. I am amazed by people who can do that. I can't. It's not in my nature. If it's not captured somewhere, written down in a way that gets updated, I'm not going to remember it. So, people tried to counteract that by, again, writing down anytime a configuration variable changed or something, but inevitably that goes out of date. Inevitably, someone changes something and forgets to update it. When you capture your infrastructure's configuration in code, whether it's through Chef, Ansible, Puppet, whatever have you, you are making your documentation executable. It's similar to that with test-driven development done well, in that we execute our program to check that it works correctly. So I can capture the way I want all of my servers to be configured in one place and automatically configure them from there. What's also nice is then anytime I need to make a change, I can make that change in one place and have it automatically propagate out to my entire fleet. It worked maybe 10, 15 years ago to have, system administrators configuring everything by hand. Facebook is one of Chef's customers. That's one of the ones I can talk about. So they have an infrastructure that serves 2 billion users. Trying to configure every piece of that infrastructure by hand would be impossible. So they use tools that Chef provides and tools I think that other providers provide as well to capture what that infrastructure should look like in code, then execute that code and automatically have their entire fleet in sync with each other and know what changed and when.
Excellent definition. You're great at explaining these concepts.
I'm glad to hear that. I always think if you can't teach something, you don't understand it. And if you can't express it in a way that someone understands it, that's a failure on you as a teacher. So I'm very glad to hear that it's coming through.
Well, and DevOps is it's a hard world to get into because there's so much jargon that as a beginner trying to get into it, you're hearing Docker, Chef, Puppeteer, and then you're confused at like what that is compared to just setting up a DigitalOcean server. And so the more people who can explain those concepts, the better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's literally a bingo card. You can download it online. I actually think there's a few of them. DevOps Buzzword Bingo. That's a fun one to have with me when I'm going to cloud focused conferences or DevOps focused conferences. There's also DevOps Against Humanity. There's a selection of cards that you can download and play it if you like. It's a good thing for the conference after party. But you're right. We are just swimming, not even swimming. We're drowning in a sea of buzzwords when it comes to DevOps. And something I tell other employees at Chef when I onboard them is if it's hard for us at Chef to find the signal and the noise, imagine what it must be like for our customers and our users.
Mm-hmm.
We need to bring some clarity to that.
One of the things that I find that we talk a lot about at the different conferences and the different things that I'm working on is open source software. And a lot of people have a lot of ideas around open source software, but we don't often think about the people who are building it and trying to maintain it. And I had a friend, John, who came to me. He's been a guest on JavaScript Jabber a couple of times. He came and he actually said, "Hey, Chuck, I wish there was a show about sustaining open source." And that really hit me where I live. And I have a few other friends who are working on projects related to this. So we all got together and we put together a show called Sustain Our Software. You can find it at sustainoursoftwarepodcast.com. And it's a place where several people who are passionate about open source come together and have conversations about how it can be sustained and how it can be maintained and what we can do to help these maintainers continue to deliver us value that we build our software on. Most of the software we're building is based on open source. And so it's important to us to have that maintained and have it taken care of. Come check it out. It's been really interesting to listen to the conversations that they're having from people who are working in it all the time and just hear what they have to say about it. Once again, that's at sustainoursoftwarepodcast.com.
So I want to focus in a little bit now on like the learning side of things. And obviously one of the good questions to ask is there's a lot of stuff that's getting talked about, a lot of stuff that's going around. There's a couple of things I maybe specifically want to ask about, but when you're looking around, you're hearing all these crazy buzzwords that are going around and all these sorts of things. What are the places people should be focused on first? Let's say that somebody who theoretically has not been involved at all in the DevOps process, whether that's, hey, I just got in charge of a team, and now I actually really care about something that I was ignoring for a while, or I'm just getting into development, I'm hearing these buzzwords, and I don't know what to educate myself on so that when I go and start interviewing for jobs, I sound smart, or at least sound knowledgeable. But where are the places that people should be thinking? We'll start with Nell and then kind of open this up to the rest, but what are parts of DevOps that people should be aware of?
When someone asks me, where should I get started learning DevOps technologies, I always say start off by pick out a major cloud provider and learn that provider really well. A lot of the major clouds, in fact, all of them have a lot of really good learning material available because it's definitely in their business interest that people know how to use their technology and know how to use it well. So that's usually where I tell people to start off with.
Why do you recommend that for the starting place?
Right. I would say if it's someone who's only deployed to Heroku, understanding the concepts of how cloud infrastructure works together is a good place to get started to move beyond that. So, I mean, for me, at least, if you want to think about where your code runs, most of us run code in the cloud right now. So start off by learning that.
That's sort of how I started learning about DevOps. I wouldn't even close to consider myself an expert or anything in DevOps. I'm still a learner, but the first ways that I started getting started was by spinning up a DigitalOcean server and trying to figure out how to put something on it and deploy something to it. And their documentation is incredible. I mean, they've got great tutorials on there. Once you start learning some of the vocabulary, you start seeing that the vocabulary that you're learning from one platform is actually more of a industry or like segment specific terminology, like cloud functions and volumes and backups and things like that. So yeah, I think that's a great way to do it, whether DigitalOcean or some other provider.
Major plus 1,000 for DigitalOcean's tutorials. They're fantastic.
Yeah, they're amazing.
I'll say one thing I think is really useful, especially in just normal development jobs, is like continuous integration. So this idea that you push your code up to Git, and then there's some sort of an automated test that runs and tells you if it passes or not. I think just understanding what's happening there and maybe how that works, looking into things like Jenkins or like Google Cloud Build, that's a good thing to do. Just because if you're developing on a team, that's like, I think probably the first DevOpsy thing that you'll encounter is just continuous integration.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. I remember getting, tasked with having to learn Circle CI and figuring out how to do the build. And okay, what do we want to involve here? We want to involve linting, an AOT build, a regular build, all these different aspects to the continuous integration part. So I think that's a great starting point for people, and then kind of expands their mind into, okay, now that I've gone through the continuous integration side, the last thing I want to do now is go ahead and deploy it. Now I got to figure out, how do I get the environmental variables set so that it works in my dev environment state, test stage or production environment, depending on what level of control they have. And it's just a great exercise in learning.
I think that's another good point too, is, learning that there's such thing as like a staging environment and a production environment, maybe a testing environment. There are all these environments that are set up very similar, but there's different environment variables that need to go into the code that's in each one. I think that's another common thing for beginners.
Okay. All right. Next question. Is Docker going to take over the DevOps world?
You couldn't see an audio.
That was a great eye roll.
That was a big eye roll. Docker is fantastic technology for containers. The thing is, containers have been around for a long time. Just Docker did kind of what Apple does, made them very, very usable at a large scale and easier for people to learn. That said, I do sometimes go into customers and they say to me, well, I want to run my entire infrastructure in containers. That's not a good idea. And the reason for that is containers are meant to be very ephemeral. They're like little services that you can spin up and spin down. If you put your persistent data in there, like the data in your database, that container is going to go away at some point and you're going to lose all of that data. So containers are a very hot buzzword right now. Someone was telling me on Twitter, or that they saw on Twitter, well, everyone says they don't use containers anymore. They use serverless now. Well, serverless still runs on servers and containers still run on servers, and you still need a place where you have data that needs to stick around from deploy to live. So I think that Docker and other container frameworks are going to continue to be very popular. I think what people are realizing now, there's some aspects of your application they're fantastic for, and some parts of the application that they're not appropriate for. And I think that's what happens with any kind of buzzword. People say, oh, we want to run everything on this, and then realize, wait a minute, it doesn't work for everything, and then backs off a little bit.
Yeah, I had a boss come in once and say, I want to rewrite our application in XSL. Who's old enough to know what that is and how ridiculous that statement is.
Are we missing a letter there? You mean XSLT or? Well,
yes, actually, XSLT is XSL was still a valid acronym, but XSLT. He wanted to. But it was, to your point. I don't want to explain the whole thing. Google XSL or XSLT if you want to see how funny that sort of a statement is, but I don't want to spend time explaining it. But the idea that I heard about this thing, now I want to go crazy with it and do it all. So then should people consider Docker as a high priority, especially developers, right? Should developers consider Docker a high priority to be on the learning list?
I would say yes, because Docker is a fantastic way to run local development environments. And I work with a nonprofit called Operation Code. We teach software engineering skills to the military community, particularly veterans who are transitioning into civilian life. And it works really well if we can tell them how to install Docker on their machine. Sometimes we have to get the machines that can run Docker because the old Macs, they can't. And some of the older machines can't. But then we tell them, this is the command you run, and you have a full development environment set up for you. It's a great way to make sure it's consistent between developers.
What's the difference between Docker and Chef, and like where would you use each one?
Absolutely. So Chef, traditionally at least, is the traditional Chef product, which is also called Chef. It gets confusing, but that is focused on actual servers. So physical servers that you have running your data, whether it's your data center or cloud provider's data center, virtual machines that you're running, you use Chef to configure the places that containers need to run when you want to run containers. So we also have some other technologies at Chef that work great with containers, but that's how I often think about it. Chef, traditional Chef is about configuration management for pieces of infrastructure where those containers will run and the pieces of your infrastructure that are not appropriate to be in containers.
So good. Can we just do an entire podcast of you explaining DevOps concepts to us? Or is that what
I'd be happy
to.
It's funny because before the episode, this is before the recording. Well, it wasn't before the recording started, but before the episode started, I was talking to Nell and saying, we're a very panel-based, and so we don't do a lot where we just ask the guest a question, but yet there's like tons of interesting stuff here. Nell, tell me this. Nell, tell me that. All right. I got another one for you along the lines of the Docker one. NETLAUGHS. First question, is NETLAUGHS going to take over the world? And then 2, where would NETLAUGHS fall on a learning path for somebody who wants to get into DevOps?
I got to be honest, I actually don't know what NETLAUGHS is.
Oh, okay. So
I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, that's a good one for the panel. And somebody want to give a brief introduction to NETLAUGHS, and then 2, say why that come up, because, here where I sit, NETLAUGHS is like everybody's talking about NETLAUGHS all day long. Who wants to volunteer to do those?
I'll just say that it's a cloud provider for deploying websites.
It's kind of like the new Heroku, right?
Yeah, it's sort of
NETLAUGHS is the cooler Heroku.
Yeah, it's taking over, and it integrates in with Git, Git providers, and you can deploy it really quickly. So it's especially been taking off with static websites like Gatsby and Next.js and things like that, where you can just pretty much deploy straight from GitHub. Yeah, they're taking over the world, and they're hiring a bunch of big names and things like that. So it's interesting to see if something like NETLAUGHS, there's also competitors like Zeit now and other ones. There's sort of this trend towards easy, one-click deployment kind of providers.
Yeah, I think that NETLAUGHS and their competitors have come in an interesting spot because Heroku was so great, but they've also supported more and more features, and they started getting more and more complex. And then NETLAUGHS stepped back in. We're back to simple, fewer features, although they're targeting a different feature set. And then, of course, their pricing model is crazy because it's not based on usage. So no matter how much usage you have, the free tier still doesn't charge you. It's only the feature set that you want. But their free tier includes custom domains and SSL, which almost nobody else did before NETLAUGHS. I think the competitors are now doing that, right, Sam? Nobody was doing that before.
Yeah, I think.
To answer a little bit my own question, I feel like NETLAUGHS is an interesting place because if you're on your own, or you're just getting into development, or you're still in school, NETLAUGHS is a great place. One, because it's free. And so it gives you your first touch of DevOps without ever having to spend a dime. And I would call it a fairly gentle introduction to the first aspects of DevOps, which is I've just been developing locally. I have something, and I just want to put it somewhere. And all the considerations about really what you have to think about with DevOps, if I don't know that stuff yet, NETLAUGHS abstracts everything else away. So I don't have to consider how many containers do I want to run? When do I want to spin up containers? Or when do I want to spin up new servers? All that sort of stuff. You don't have to worry. I've recently been learning AWS, and oh my goodness, if I just feel like I'm in a big mud pile.
It's alphabet soup.
Yeah, it really is. And there's so many tools, and each tool is different, and just configuring user rights. Woo! I need a degree to do that. But NETLAUGHS is just extremely simple, and their competitors. So kind of put that question back out there, right? Where would you guys put NETLAUGHS on the scope of, hey, people, check this out as you're starting to get into DevOps?
I think I set out to answer the question, what is it that I don't need to learn in order to deploy my site? What can I live without? What can I abstract away? And they answered it. Of course, you can't really compare it to Heroku deeply because Heroku supports things like back-end technologies. So NETLAUGHS came at a moment where we started breaking over applications instead of having that monolith, application that is rendering everything on the server. They came out when we started breaking that into APIs and front ends. And then also the whole idea of serverless and cloud functions and all of that stuff that we don't have to have together anymore with our front end. That was right at that spot. NETLAUGHS shows up and says, well, your front end is just static stuff. So deploy it with us. And then everything else you get from the web, everything you get as APIs, and you deploy that somewhere else. So they kind of find that nice niche, and then they say, how can I make it simpler? What is it that you don't really need to know about in order to deploy this? Because we're talking about learning DevOps, but one part of that is picking up the stuff that we don't need and concentrating or focusing only on the stuff that matters to us. So I think they did that very well, and they gave us like a real simple solution for that, to say, learn this, and then the rest you learn if you need it, if you're going to go into that particular field. But as a developer, you don't need to know about this stuff, so you don't need it in order to deploy.
So would Netlify be something you'd only run the front end of your website on? Okay, so it sounds like, it works well, but
it's a tiny piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I think they have a functions product similar to AWS and Google and everywhere else. Yeah, I think Luis brings up a good point of like, I think it depends a lot on what your model is. If you're working on a side project that's just a static site, that's not going to need any DevOps or anything. But once you cross the threshold into having a database and servers or backends that are supplying that data, and you're going to need to account for things like high availability or protecting against usage attacks or things like that, then you're going to start having to cross over into the DevOps threshold.
Even farther, yeah. Go ahead, Nell.
I think of situations I've been in where that has worked really well. So I've used GitHub Pages for similar, when I want to just run a static front end for something. And I hope it's okay to say this. I worked on the Clinton campaign in 2016, and working on a presidential campaign, oh my God, tightest deadlines, tightest money, highest stake you will ever deal with. And what we had to do was we had to get applications out extremely fast because we had to get them out when a certain narrative was going. And guess what? 24-hour news cycle, that changes all the time. So in that case, we specifically erred or geared ourselves toward very non-complex applications that we could deploy extremely quickly and then pull down, and then we could edit extremely quickly as well. So Netlify strikes me as something that would be appropriate for that kind of need.
All right. So we're getting close to, we've been at this for a bit. I'd like to kind of finalize with one question and coming back again to the really the learning aspect of things. We talked about 3 really awesome resources that you mentioned already. One, the Adventures in DevOps podcast. 2, the Phoenix Project book you mentioned. And then 3, the idea of pick a cloud provider and go through their tutorials. Are there any other learning resources people should be aware of when they're starting to dig into wherever they are, where they're first getting into it, or they just want to take the next level wherever they at, take the next step in DevOps type stuff? What are other resources people should be aware of that they may not be aware of?
So a buzzword you're going to hear a lot is Kubernetes, which is container orchestration. Once you get the basics of cloud providers, if you want to just know what the vocabulary of Kubernetes means, or what is this thing that everyone and their mother seems to be talking about, I will find a link to this, but there's the Children's Guide to Kubernetes, which is a wonderfully illustrated story about Pippi, the little PHP app who looks like a giraffe, and her finding a home to run that works best for her particular needs. And it goes through very high-level concepts of what's behind it. So if you're curious about Kubernetes, highly recommend checking that out. It's a quick read. You could probably read it to your kids, and they'd like it. And it's a nice, gentle introduction into what the concepts are and a peek behind the buzzwords.
Can you give us a quick description of what it means to orchestrate containers?
Right. So containers came out. Someone's making a conductor orchestration. It kind of is like that. My in-laws are professional musicians. But what it is everyone said, all right, we want to run stuff in containers. And we want to run different parts of our app in different parts of containers. Well, when you're running different parts of your app in different containers or different virtual machines, different whatever, you need a way for them to communicate together. And it turns out networking, in particular with containers, is really hard, and trying to make it so the right ones can talk to the other right ones at the right time. So what an orchestrator is, something like Kubernetes or Docker Swarm is another example, is it's a way for me to have a configuration template of what containers should be running in what combinations at any given time, and how they should communicate with each other. And as I mentioned before, you don't want to store persistent data in containers. Also, where should they send persistent data? So it's a great way. Containers are great, but they do add a lot of complexity. And it's a kind of an abstraction over that complexity. All right, we've got these different containers. How are they going to work together? And how are they going to come together as a whole?
So good.
I'm glad.
I have two DevOps learning resources, and both of them are going to sound really self-serving, but it is what it is. First of all, my coworker at Auth0, Bruno Krebs, has been writing some really, really good articles on Kubernetes. He's got a step-by-step intro to basic concepts and several other tutorials, and he's doing an amazing job. They're really helpful articles. The other one that also sounds self-serving is Julian Farrer's material on Docker, which he had originally released elsewhere, and now it's up on Thinkster. But I've gone through the course myself, and he does an amazing job of walking you step by step through every possible concept in Docker.
Yeah.
And he doesn't show you the shortcuts in the beginning. Like, he walks through everything manually. And then when you get to the shortcuts of, like, you know, the quicker way to do things, then you actually understand what's going on. And it's just really, really well done. So, and Julian's a great guy, so it's also good.
Anything else that comes to mind on anybody? Are we ready to wrap up? Cool. Well, Nell, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really, this has been really cool.
We've been recording Ruby Rogue since 2011, and we've talked to a lot of people who have had a really deep influence, not only on the programming community, but also on the Ruby community. And as we've talked to these people, it's become apparent to me that we talk a lot about the things that make them interesting that they've done, but we don't really get into how they got into programming or how they came up in their career, how they got to be the person who invented whatever library or technique that they came on the show to talk about. And so I put together a show where we actually highlight these things. We talk to them about how they got into programming. We talk to them about how they got into Ruby, maybe how they got into Rails. We get a little bit deep into what makes them tick and why they are the way they are. And then we talk about what they're working on. We talk about the things that make them well known or make them interesting. And a lot of times it's the stuff that goes beyond the code that really makes these people tick and makes them the kind of people that we want to hear about. And so I put together a show called My Ruby Story. You can find it at myrubystory.com. And it's where I interview these people and just get the stories of these people and how they came into programming. So if you want to hear inspirational stories or get ideas on how you can actually advance your career, then go check it out at myrubystory.com.
We're going to wrap up by doing go through the panel and everybody, including Nell, and talk about one thing that you would tell a friend if that friend did not know about that thing. So other shows call these like picks, but basically like something you think is cool that you would want other people to know about. Who's up for going first? Luis?
Yes. I'd say do a big favor to yourself and go learn Markdown. Okay, you're going to be writing documentation. You could use that. Like I use it as my note-taking tool. So Markdown, learn it. It's very useful.
Cool. Who's up next?
I'll go. I just downloaded this like journaling app it's on Mac, but it's also for Android too, called Day One. And it basically just lets you can write journal entries each day. So I started journaling with that app, which I think has been pretty cool. So it's called Day One.
That's a very cool app. I like Day One a lot. I also had a writing themed pick this week, which is the app Ulysses, which might also only be for Mac, but it's on Mac OS and iOS. And Ulysses is a really awesome writing app. It lets you organize things really easily. It supports Markdown. I really enjoy it.
Awesome. Who's next? Don't everybody go at once.
I'm happy to go. So what comes to my mind is I've had a couple of friends go through surgery recently, and I had shoulder surgery a couple of years ago, which is awful. I don't recommend it if you can avoid it, but sometimes it's necessary. And I used an app called Round. I think it's only available on iOS, but I imagine there must be something similar on Android. And what was great about it was I could program it, or my wife could program it, to tell me exactly when I needed to take medication, because I had to take like 8 different ones in different combinations throughout the day. Tell me exactly what I need to take, exactly at that time, and exactly how much. So when you're on painkillers after surgery, it's really hard to remember this stuff. So it was great to have, on my phone, or I have an Apple Watch, or on my Apple Watch, get a little reminder, tell me exactly what to take and how much. So I highly recommend that app.
Very cool. Very cool. Jesse?
All right. I was like, what am I going to talk about? But I think the two things I've been using more lately and trying to get back into it, one is Headspace. finding some time to take some time out and meditate in the mornings. Along those lines, kind of do Tim Ferriss with some of his kind of morning routines, kind of helps out. And then let's see, that's pretty much it. Those are kind of the things I'm focused on. Oh, the other one I was going to say is Grammarly. So I really struggle when I'm writing emails because it's a conscious stream that's just flowing through my fingers here. And then I go back and look at it. I'm like, oh, this is, and then Grammarly's already like underlying stuff and changes punctuation and whatnot. So I have found that to be very helpful.
Awesome. And I'll wrap up by mentioning Tile, not the building material, but the product that helps you keep track of your things. 2 keys for cars. I have a lot of drivers, so we can't just have like one key set with all the keys on them because keys have to be passed around a lot. And I was always so anxious. Keys nowadays are like $200 to replace these stupid fobs that you can only get at the dealer, and it's just ridiculous. And so for this little $10 tile that I can stick onto the key and know that I can never lose now my keys ever again, so nice to have. So that'll be my thing is these tiles. I think the Tile Mate is the one that I use, but they have a few models.
Google gave us one of those at a GDE thing like a year or two ago, and I didn't know what it was, and so I gave it away. And all I've ever heard since is how great those things are.
Yeah. I have one, and I have it in my pocket right now. And the funny thing is I'll be sitting in a meeting, and I'll just kind of like pinch, sit a certain way, and all of a sudden it'll click the button, and my phone's like blowing up. And
so that's awesome.
Of those funny things going on. But yeah, they're great because not only can I find the keys, but also I can use my keys to find my phone. So as long as I don't lose both of them at the same time, they're fantastic.
It's like multi-factor authentication, but for your belongings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Both at the same time.
Yeah. I put them in the funniest places. I put them in my wife's purse, in my backpack, on every key. And, they're just so small. And the battery lasts for like a year, and then you can just replace them with a watch battery. So put them on anything that's important.
Yeah, I've been thinking about putting one on, like embedding it into my snowboard, because the snowboard's kind of expensive, right?
Right. Yeah, that's actually why I put it in my backpack, because it's not that I ever lose my backpack. It's that if it ever gets stolen, it's this tiny little thing in the very bottom. Somebody would grab it to grab my laptop, and then I could potentially track it down. So,
are they light enough that you could put them on a pet's collar?
Yes, they are light enough to put them on a pet's collar. That. They're not 100% fantastic of like, I don't need real-time notification of exactly where something is at the moment, because it requires that other phones that have the Tile app have been around the thing recently. So they're really great for, I know the keys are somewhere here in the house and I can walk around. Eventually the Bluetooth's going to connect to it and then it'll start ringing. Or you can look and say, hey, the last time it was seen was, some other address. It may not be at that address at that moment, right? So it's not necessarily great for real time, but for just your typical stuff like, where are my keys? They're somewhere either in the house or they might be out in the car or something like that. But there's, I don't need live GPS updates. They're not really built for that.
Right. Yeah, because I always leave my phone like in the dryer or not on top of the dryer because I'm
in the dryer.
Okay. Not in it, on it.
How do you still have a phone?
Yeah. I close the doors and I'm like, where's my phone? And I can't find it. And Tile's awesome.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, we'll wrap up with that. Thanks again, Nell, for coming on the show. This was great. Thanks, everybody, for the panel. And thanks, everybody, for listening. We will be back later on with another episode.
Take care, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Adios.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.